Hello, welcome back. So we're now well into our second unit, which is on the philosophy of sex. And as I've already pointed out on a few occasions, it's primarily concerned with the ethics of sex. Now, in our last couple lectures, we looked at the concept of sexual perversion, which has been an important concept in the history of the philosophy of sex, and which, as we've seen, denotes a distortion or a deformity of the nature of the sexual instinct. Um, Now, today we're going to move on to the concept of sexual objectification, which is exactly what it sounds like. Okay? To objectify someone sexually is to treat them in some way as an object, right? As an object to satisfy your sexual pleasure or your sexual desire. Um, Now, if you read the paper by Sobel and Helwani a few lectures ago, you've already read a little bit about sexual objectification, and you've seen there that it's been a very important concept in the history of the philosophy of sex and also in the contemporary philosophy of sex. And it's also been a very important concept in the history of feminist philosophy, as well as in contemporary feminist philosophy. So if you read Mary Wollstonecraft, who's an early modern feminist, a lot of what she says can be understood through the lens of sexual objectification. Okay, even though she doesn't use that word. And then once you get to the 20th century and the work of Martha Nussbaum, you find a lot there about sexual objectification, and she does use that word explicitly. But one of the most famous articulations of the concept of sexual objectification you can find in the work of Immanuel Kant, okay, the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who influenced both Mary Wollstonecraft and Martha Nussbaum, among other people. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what Kant thinks about the concept of sexual objectification. So we are now moving on to a brand new historical period, and we're moving on to a very different historical period, okay? A lot of things change between the Middle Ages, which is where we've been for the last few weeks with Thomas Aquinas, and the modern period. And so I'm going to spend about half the lecture talking about this change of context to help you understand what is going on, okay? Why is the way that Kant thinks about ethics more broadly, but also specifically about sexual ethics, so different, right? What changes? So we'll talk a little bit about modern science, okay, advances in science between the Middle Ages and the modern period that really change our way of understanding the world. We'll talk about the process of social secularization that you can observe in Western countries, so in Europe, basically, during the modern period. And we'll talk a little bit about the humanist outlook that arises during this period. Okay, the new way of understanding human beings, their place in the world, and our duties. Okay, this is basically what changes in the modern period is we understand all these things in a very different way. Then, after that's done, for the second half of the lecture, we'll talk about Kant's lectures on ethics. Okay, I had you read a fairly short excerpt for this lecture and for the next, and it's an excerpt from Kant's lectures on ethics, which are basically just lectures that he gave, right? They're notes taken down by his students during his lectures. And I'll explain a little bit more why I got you to read this and not one of his published works. So we'll talk about the background of the lectures on ethics, what they are, as well as the ethical framework that Kant defends there, as well as in his other ethical works. Then we'll talk about how he understands the sexual instinct or the sexual impulse and how that relates to sexual objectification. Okay, as a bit of a spoiler, Kant is going to argue that the sexual instinct is an instinct toward objectification. Okay, he thinks that what the sexual instinct does is to objectify. And so you'll see that for Kant, the sexual instinct just is an instinct toward making someone into an object for your own sexual gratification. That's what it is. And so, as you can guess, from Kant's perspective, there's going to be some moral problems with the sexual instinct or with the sexual impulse. And so that's where we'll end for today. Then next time, we'll keep talking about Kant. We'll finish talking about Kant. And we'll see under what conditions he thinks it's possible to have sex with somebody without objectifying them, without reducing them to the status of an object. So first things first, like I said, we're now talking about a new historical period. We're now talking about the modern period, or if you prefer, the period known as modernity. And as you can see, my slide says the modern secular context. And you might be wondering, Why? Right? Why am I calling it secular? To say that something is secular, by the way, is simply to say that it's non-religious. Okay? And so, in calling the modern period secular, what I'm saying is not that suddenly nobody's religious anymore. That's not true. What I'm saying, rather, is that during the modern period, you see a gradual decline of the influence of religion in various spheres of life. And so, if you think about the ancient period as being defined, at least in the West, by, Greek and Roman religion, and the Middle Ages as being defined by Catholicism, well, the modern period, I guess one of its defining features is this gradual secularization that happens. Okay, and so this is why I'm calling it the modern secular context. So here is our timeline of Western history. And if you look on here, you see that the transition between the Middle Ages and modernity is usually considered to be somewhere around the year 1500 AD. Okay, this is where we shift from one period, the Middle Ages, into a new period, modernity. And so you might be wondering, okay, well, what happens around 1500 AD? And the answer is everything. Okay, everything happens. Um, what I mean by that is simply that there are a lot of different things that happen that cause a huge shift in our understanding of the world. Okay, and that has ramification on almost every aspect of social and political life. Now, of course, some of these ramifications happen quite gradually. Okay, it's not like suddenly in 1500 everything changes in one shot, but a lot of big changes happen all around the same time that end up having repercussions over the next few hundred years. Okay, so between Aquinas, who was living around the year 1250 AD, and Kant, who's writing in the 1770s, so almost 300 years into modernity, a lot of enormous changes happen. So around the year 1500 AD, what happens? Well, for one, there's what's called the scientific revolution. Okay? And the scientific revolution produces a brand new understanding of the natural world and of our place inside it. At about the same time, there's what's called the Protestant Reformation. So basically, a bunch of Christians have a lot of disagreements with the theology of the Catholic Church, and they rebel against the Catholic Church and they split off from it. Okay, so what you have is a division within Western Christianity, basically for the first time in 1,000 years or more. Okay, and so what you have is, for the first time in a very long time, religious pluralism in the West. Not everybody has the same religious beliefs. Now, the immediate consequence of this is like 100 years of war and a whole bunch of persecution. But eventually, Western countries have to deal with the fact that there is religious pluralism, okay, among them. And then the third big change I want to draw attention to is the rise of market economies. Okay, during the Middle Ages, your economic activity is extremely restricted. If you're a peasant, you're just tied down to the same piece of land for your entire life, and you have to work on that piece of land. Not only that, but that piece of land was, your parents before you and their parents before them, and so on and so forth. So you're very tied down geographically to a particular piece of land. And for that reason, you're also very tied down culturally to a particular context, right? But then with the rise of market economies, you start having free trade between countries, and also more free trade between cities of the same country. And you start having, first off, a much more global society where the world is much more in contact than it was before, but also a lot more economic freedom for individuals. And so what happens is people leave their traditional pieces of land and they end up converging in big cities where there's a lot more economic opportunity. Okay, and in the long run, the upshot of all this is that people come to understand themselves in much more individualistic terms. Right? So instead of understanding themselves as being tied down to a particular piece of land, to a particular tradition, they increasingly see themselves as individuals, right, in search of the best opportunities for themselves. And so what all this produces, right, the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the rise of market economies, we can also add to that, like the discovery of the New World, and all kinds of other changes happen at the same time. The upshot is just the collapse of the medieval European order. Okay, the European societies used to be traditional societies based on a shared religion, and then very suddenly, this starts to erode. Again, the consequences, the repercussions take a longer time to really come about. But all these processes begin very quickly, all at the same time, around the year 1500. Okay, so now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the repercussions of these occurrences in a bit more detail to give you a taste of how much things change, okay, because things change enormously. So first, I said that there was the scientific revolution. So I'll tell you a little bit about modern science. The scientific revolution, by the way, is a movement within science that was promoted by people that you probably heard about in high school, like Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Bacon, Descartes. And what these people do, well, first off, is they promote empiricism in the natural science. Okay, they promote what's come to be known as the scientific method. Empiricism, by the way, basically just means observation. Okay, to study something empirically is to study it by observation. And so the scientific method that people like Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Bacon, and Descartes develop proceeds by observation, proceeds by testing. This is how we do natural science now. And with this empirical approach, this approach that consists in proposing hypotheses and then testing them by observation, comes a kind of skepticism about tradition. Okay, because what happens early in the modern period is that people start to realize that falsehoods have made it into the traditional body of knowledge, right? The body of things that traditionally people had thought were true, people had thought they knew, turned out to contain things that were false. Okay, the biggest example of this was the discovery in the early modern period that the geocentric model of the cosmos was false. Okay, geocentrism is simply the view that the sun and the other planets turn around the Earth. Okay, this is what people had thought for thousands of years. But then, early in the modern period, it's discovered that geocentrism is false. Heliocentrism is true. Heliocentrism is the view that the Earth and other planets turn around the sun. Okay, people discover this. And so this sensitizes them to the fact that just because something has traditionally been believed and affirmed, including by the church, doesn't mean it's true. Okay, and so this gives rise to the need to call tradition into question and to test it, right? To find an independent basis for those beliefs, to test them independently of just tradition. Now, here's what's really crucial for us. One enormous repercussion of this scientific revolution is a mechanistic understanding of the universe. Okay, this is a very different way of understanding the natural world from the one that you had during the Middle Ages. Remember, during the Middle Ages, science involves studying the four causes, right? We saw that Aristotle thought that every natural entity had four causes, and that during the medieval period, just about everybody was an Aristotelian. And so they thought that to understand a natural entity, you had to understand its four causes. You had to understand its material cause, right? The matter that it's made of. You had to understand its formal cause, right? The way in which that matter is organized or the way that it's shaped. You had to understand its efficient cause, so the source of the movement that organized it in that way or that gave it that particular shape. And then finally, you had to understand its final cause. And the final cause is its aim or its purpose or its function. It is, to use the Greek word, it's telos. Okay, and of course, within a Christian perspective, this means it is the aim or the purpose or the function that God gave to it. Okay, so it's just taken for granted by everybody in the medieval period and by all scientists in the medieval period that things, natural entities, have purposes, right? They have the purposes that God gave to them. And so understanding the natural entities requires, among other things, understanding their purposes. This means that science includes teleology, right? It includes the study of purposes. And what happens during the modern period is that this understanding of science falls away. People increasingly come to understand the natural world simply in terms of matter in motion. In other words, they understand it in terms of particles of matter and the forces to which they're subject. Okay, if you know your history of science a little bit, this is the birth of what's called particle physics. And so what does this mean? Well, if you understand the entire natural world simply as this big piece of machinery that is particles of matter subjected to certain forces, and you can understand everything that happens in terms of those particles and those forces, well, you're no longer talking about formal causes, and you're no longer talking about final causes. Okay, that's crucial. You're no longer talking about purposes. So people come to think that it's possible to explain everything that happens in nature without reference to purposes, okay, without references to aims or functions, without references to telos, okay? And so, although some people continue to believe that there are purposes in nature, this is no longer part of the scientific enterprise. So if you believe that, well, that's part of your private religious beliefs. It's not part of what you can demonstrate to other people by science. Okay, so this is, of course, an enormous shift in our understanding of the world. You go from thinking that everything in the world is made for some purpose to thinking that, well, things just don't have purposes independently of the purposes that we give them. Okay, so this leads pretty naturally to the second big ramification that I want to tell you about, which is the process of social secularization in Europe and eventually North America. Okay, so again, to say that something is secular is to say that it's non-religious. And so to talk about a process of secularization is to talk about a process by which the influence of religion declines. This is a repercussion of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so the Protestant Reformation, remember, is a split that happens within Western Christianity between, on the one hand, the Roman Catholic Church, which was the dominant power during the entire Middle Ages, really, and on the other hand, various groups that were protesting against the Catholic Church. Okay, groups of Christians that were protesting against certain practices and against certain beliefs of the Catholic Church. And this is why they came to be called the Protestants, right? They're protesting against the Catholic Church. And so what you get is pluralism in Western societies, right? A diversity of religious beliefs within Western societies. Now, the first thing that happens is like 100 years of warfare where the Catholics are fighting the Protestants, and actually different splinter groups of Protestants are fighting against each other. But then eventually, people think, okay, well, maybe to put an end to all this warfare, we should just tolerate religious disagreement, right? This seems obvious to us, but it's a solution that took a very long time to develop and to accept. And so at first, rulers' religious disagreement was tolerated. So if you were a ruler, like a king, you could be Catholic or Protestant. But then everybody who lived in your country had to follow suit, right? So either they had to convert to your religion or they had to leave. But then eventually, again, these repercussions happen quite gradually. Eventually, countries start to tolerate religious disagreement even among their citizens. Okay, so you as a citizen could have your own religious beliefs. And so suddenly, of course, big spheres of social life, there are big spheres of social life where you just can't assume that everybody has the same religious beliefs as you, right? There are different people living together who have different religious beliefs. Now, one sphere of life where this has a particularly important impact is in the sphere of politics. Okay, so again, very gradually over time, people begin to advocate for a separation between church and state. Okay, so in other words, they begin to advocate for the activity of the state or of the government, the laws that it passes and that it enforces, to be separate from the authority of any particular church, right, of the Catholic Church or any of the Protestant churches. And this makes sense, right? If you've got a bunch of people with different religious beliefs living together, they're not going to want one church that isn't theirs to dictate what everybody has to do. So what happens as a result is that religious belief becomes increasingly privatized. Okay? Instead of being a matter of what everybody around you believes, it becomes a matter of what you believe. Okay? It becomes a matter of your individual conscience, your individual beliefs, your individual lifestyle. And so people remain religious. Right? During the modern period in Europe and North America, most people do remain religious, but they understand their belonging to a religion in a very different way, in a much more individualistic kind of way. Now, I hope you can see that this involved a huge shift in how people understood the authority of the state, right? Where the authority of government comes from, as well as how they understood their relation to their society. And this leads me, again, quite naturally, to the next big repercussion I want to draw your attention to, which is the rise of a new humanist outlook, okay? A humanist moral outlook. I'm calling this humanist simply because it places human beings at the center of morality. Okay, so what happens during the early modern period, again, quite gradually, is that people begin to develop new theories of morality. in the terms that we introduced a few lectures ago, new normative theories to explain what makes an action right or wrong. And although they come to very different answers here, their answers have one thing in common, which is that they place human beings at the center of morality. Okay, so during this time, you see the development of frameworks that understand ethics in terms of respecting human freedom, or that understand it in terms of promoting human well-being. Okay, this might not be obvious to you, but these are actually quite different approaches, and we'll talk about how they're different. But the first of them, which says that morality is a matter of respecting the freedom of individual human beings, is associated with Kantian ethics, which we're going to talk about today. Whereas the second approach, which says that morality has to do with promoting the well-being of individual human beings, has to do with utilitarian ethics, which we're going to talk about in our next topic. Okay, but in both these cases, human beings, individuals, are at the center of morality. This is very different from the approach that you saw during the Middle Ages, right? As we've seen, during the Middle Ages, people thought that what made an action right or wrong is whether it accorded with the natural order of things. The natural order that God put there, right? The purposes that God put in nature. But again, with all the social changes that are happening, the scientific revolution, the privatization of religious belief, the increasing individualization of people, this moral framework kind of collapses. Okay, it ceases to be a plausible framework for a lot of people. And so what people are doing during this period in developing these new normative ethical theories is trying to place morality on a secular basis. Okay, both Kantian ethics, which we're going to talk about this lecture, and utilitarian ethics, which we're going to talk about in our next topic, are attempts to place ethics on a secular basis, right, on a non-religious basis. Now, one thing that's very important to note is that these humanist outlooks tended to be much more egalitarian. Okay, as we've already seen, egalitarianism is the view that all human beings are in some sense equal, that they're morally equal. Now, different theories might have different accounts of why all human beings are equal. Okay, so from a Kantian point of view, maybe you'll say that all human beings are equal because they're all autonomous, right? They're all capable of living their lives rationally. From a utilitarian perspective, you might say that all human beings are equal because they're all sentient, they're all capable of feeling pleasure and pain. But in either case, you have a much more egalitarian view of human society. Remember, this is in sharp contrast to the very hierarchical view of society that we saw in ancient Greece and that we saw again in the Middle Ages, right? In ancient Greece, we saw there was this very hierarchical society with a class hierarchy and a sex hierarchy. And then we saw that during the medieval period with the Christian perspective, with the Christian worldview, you have a kind of egalitarianism where everybody's understood to be equal in the eyes of God, but you don't have a social egalitarianism at all, right? You still have social hierarchies with different classes and sex hierarchies and all this. Well, now in the modern period, again, quite gradually, you see the development of a much more egalitarian outlook, okay? And this is, of course, connected with the view that there are no purposes in nature. Okay, people in ancient Greece, people in the medieval period thought that there were hierarchies in nature too, right? Some people were by nature higher than or better than, more valuable than others. But this ceases to fly in the modern period, okay? We don't understand nature like that anymore. And so during this time, you see a lot of pushes for social change. Okay? You see a lot of people advocating for constitutional democracy instead of monarchy. Okay? And gradually societies change from monarchies, societies with kings, to constitutional democracies where the power is to various degrees in the hands of the people. Around the same time, you see movements advocating for feminism. Okay, so early feminist movements that tried to get more rights for women who had never had, as we've seen, a lot of social rights, allow them to enter into the workforce, things like this, get an education. And at the same time, you also get the rise of the anti-slavery movement. Okay, for just about the entire history of the human species in almost all societies, people thought slavery was okay. But then during the modern period, as a result of all these trends that we've been talking about, people begin to think that no, slavery is morally wrong. Making another human being into an object, right, either trampling that human being's freedom or disregarding that human being's well-being is morally wrong. Okay, so in all these different ways, you start to see challenges to traditional hierarchies. And again, quite gradually, taking several hundred years, the creation of more and more egalitarian social institutions. Okay, I hope that this gives you a sense of how much society changes in the modern period, because it changes enormously. Okay, with all these things, what you get is basically the toppling of the traditional medieval order and the gradual arising of something that is very different, very new. Now, with all that context out of the way, we're able to understand the background against which Kant develops his moral theory and against which he develops his sexual ethics. So now let's turn to that. Now, before we start talking about the lectures on ethics, though, I want to tell you a little bit about Kant himself. So here is Immanuel Kant. As you can see from the dates there, he was an 18th century philosopher. He wrote his most important works near the very end of the 18th century, so between like the 1770s and 1790s or so. He was a German philosopher, and he was part of the intellectual or philosophical movement known as the European Enlightenment. And the European Enlightenment was a movement that emphasized a lot of the features of modernity that I just called your attention to. Okay, so it was all about reason, progress, democracy, secularism. Okay, these are the kinds of things that philosophers like Kant advocated for. And Kant is often regarded as one of the greatest, if not the single greatest philosopher of the European Enlightenment. Now, like most of the philosophers that we're reading in this class, Kant wrote pretty widely. Okay? He wrote on metaphysics and ethics, aesthetics, politics. He actually wrote some works on science as well. But probably what had the most influence, or what has had the most influence, is his moral philosophy. Okay, and actually, his moral and political philosophy has influenced contemporary political institutions. Okay, so he was a big influence on the development of international human rights in the 20th century, and actually on the development of the United Nations. And he also had a big influence on the development of constitutional democracy in various parts of the world. Now, the thing about Kant, though, is that he is a notoriously obscure writer. I've stressed to you in this class how important it is in philosophy to be very clear. And the problem with Kant is that he is anything but. If you read any of his major works, it is very difficult to figure out what he's talking about. And this is why I didn't get you to read any passages from his major works, okay? Because I just think you wouldn't have been able to make heads or tails of it. So what I did instead is get you to read passages from his lectures on ethics. What are those? They're actually just notes taken by his students while he was lecturing to them. Because apparently, although he was a notoriously obscure writer, he seems to have been a very clear lecturer, okay? So I find it much more useful when teaching Kant, especially at a first-year level, to get students to read excerpts from his lectures and not from any of his published works. So that's why I got you to read what I got you to read. Now, if I'm going to help you understand what Kant says about sexual ethics in the lectures on ethics, though, I should probably say a few words about his general moral theory. So in the lectures on ethics, but also in a couple of his most important works, The Groundwork to the Metaphysics of Morals and The Critique of Practical Reason, Kant develops his moral philosophy. And what he says he's trying to do is to find a rational foundation for morality. Okay, so in the terms that we introduced a few lectures ago, what Kant is doing is developing a normative ethical theory. He's trying to provide an account of what makes an action right or wrong. But importantly, as a modern philosopher, as a philosopher of the European Enlightenment, he's trying to show that you can ground morality in reason. Okay, so you don't have to appeal to tradition, right, to what we've always done, or to religion, right, to what we think God wants, in order to explain what makes an action right or wrong. You can appeal simply, he thinks, to reason or to rational demands. And he frames what he's doing as searching for the supreme principle of morality. Okay, so Kant's idea is that if morality is going to be rational, it must be that it's regular, okay, that we're able to understand it in terms of certain regularities. And so, he thinks, there must be some one principle from which all of our moral duties can be derived, right? If we're going to explain why some action is permissible and some others are impermissible and some others are obligatory, it must be that we can explain all of that in terms of a single principle. This is what he thinks is required if morality is going to be rational. Now, I'm not going to explain the details of his argument or like the metaphysical framework that he's proposing, but I will say that this one supreme principle of morality is what he famously calls the categorical imperative. Okay, so it's the imperative, right, the command that is categorical, that applies across the board all the time universally. Now, confusingly though, although Kant claims that there's just the one supreme principle of morality, right, just the one categorical imperative, he at the same time claims that this one principle can be formulated in multiple different ways. Okay, so he claims that there's different formulas of one and the same principle. And the big problem is that it's not clear at all that these different formulas or these different formulations actually say the same thing. Okay, now I'm not going to get into this with you. I'm not going to get into what the different formulas say and whether they ultimately say the same thing or not. If we were doing like an intro to ethics, I might spend some time on that. But for our purposes here, I think the best thing to do is just to tell you about the one formulation that is the most important to understanding what he says about sexual ethics in the short excerpt that I got you to read. Okay, and this one formulation is often called the formula of humanity. There's a nice link there, right, to the humanist ethics that I told you people start to develop in the modern period. And so here I've got my copy of Kant's practical works, including the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals and the critique of practical reason. And here is how he words the formula of humanity. Okay, so it says, act in such a way that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Okay, so what the formula of humanity says is that you must always treat humanity as an end in itself and never merely as a means to your ends. Okay, so let me try and explain that in a bit more detail. To say that something is a means to your end, as we've already seen in this class, is to say that they're just a tool or an instrument for you to achieve your goals. Okay, if I'm using you as a means to my ends, I am using you as a tool or an instrument. To treat them as an end to treat somebody as an end in itself is instead to treat them as being their own goal. Okay, or the way to maybe better understand this is to treat them as a being with their own goals that are just as important to them as your goals are important to you. Okay, so when Kant says that you must always treat humanity as an end in itself, as never only as a means to your ends, he's saying you have to treat people as rational beings that are capable of pursuing their own life goals rationally the same way you are, and not merely as inanimate tools for you to reach your goals. Okay, that is the formula of humanity that is at the basis of Kantian ethics. And so you see how the idea here is to respect the autonomy of rational beings. Right? Again, the idea is you are a rational being, and by virtue of being a rational being, you can pursue your ends rationally. But other people are also rational beings with the same capacity, and you need to respect their capacity, their ability to make decisions of their own in light of their own reasoning. Okay, that's what it is to treat human beings as ends in themselves, and not to use them merely as your own means. Now, there's an important clarification to make here. Kant does not say that it's always wrong to use somebody as a means to your ends. Okay, that would be very extreme because we use each other as means to our ends all the time. Think about it. You order an Uber. You're using the Uber as a tool to get to your destination. You hire an employee. You're using the employee as a tool to serve your customers. Or you start working for an employer. You use the employer as a tool to get your paycheck. You go to the store to buy something. You use the cashier as a tool in order to get what you want, right? Of course, it's okay to use each other as a means to our own ends. What Kant says is that you must never use someone merely as a means to your ends, right? So you must, while using them as a means to your ends, So as an instrument to get what you want, at the same time, treat them as an end in itself. That is, treat them as another being who, like you, is trying to pursue their own goals rationally. So let's go back to our examples with the Uber driver and the employee and the employer and the cashier. How do you treat them at the same time as ends in themselves? Well, by treating them as rational beings who are capable of making their own decisions. So I would be treating my Uber driver as a mere means to an end if I were to refuse to pay him, right? Because then I would just be using his services without treating him as a being with his own goals. But by paying him, I respect him as a being capable of making his own decisions about what's in his own good, right? I decide that it's in my own good to give up this money in exchange for this ride. He decides that it's in his own good to give up that time where he's driving me in exchange for that money. And so we're able to come to an agreement together. That is, although we're both using each other, we're doing it in a way that respects the autonomy of the other. Okay. And you're going to be able to tell the same story with the employer and the employee and with the cashier. In all these cases, you've got people who are entering into agreements such that they can use somebody, but at the same time, respect their autonomy as a rational being. Okay. Now, again, Kant thinks that this categorical imperative, this one principle, is the supreme principle of all of morality. Okay, so he thinks that you can use this one principle to explain why stealing is wrong, and why killing is wrong, and why cheating is wrong, and why lying is wrong, and why slavery is wrong, and so on and so forth. Okay, this one principle is supposed to be able to show all of that. Now, I'm not going to go over, his reasoning here. I'll leave it to you to figure out why he would say that each of these things is wrong. But ultimately, what's important is that he thinks that you can derive all of morality from this one principle, the categorical imperative. Okay, so with that out of the way, we can better understand Kant's views, not only about the sexual instinct or the sexual impulse, but also about why the sexual impulse is morally problematic. Okay, here is a long quotation. He says, "Man has an impulse directed to others, not so that he may enjoy their works and circumstances, but immediately to others as objects of his enjoyment. This is the sexual impulse." Okay, so the sexual impulse, according to Kant, is an impulse to use another human being for your enjoyment. Now, you might think, okay, what's the big deal? There's all kinds of ways in which I use other human beings for my enjoyment, right? Think about when you go see a movie. You're using all of the people who made the movie for your enjoyment. Think about when you go to a concert. You're using the musicians for your enjoyment. Think about even when you hang out with friends. You use other human beings for your enjoyment. But according to Kant, there's an important difference between all these things and the sexual impulse. He says, man can certainly enjoy the other as an instrument for his service. He can utilize the other's hands or feet to serve him through the latter's free choice. But we never find that a human being can be the object of another's enjoyment save through the sexual impulse. Okay, so what's the distinction he's trying to make here? Well, he seems to be saying that there's all kinds of ways in which you can enjoy another human being for their talents, for their personality, for their interests, for their virtues, things like this, right? In my example of the performers or the musicians or just the friends you hang out with, these are the kinds of things that you get enjoyment out of. You're getting enjoyment from something to do with who they are as a person. But the sexual impulse, Kant is saying, isn't an impulse to enjoy another person's talents or their personality or their interest or their virtues or anything like that. Right? Instead, it's an impulse to gain enjoyment from their body, right, as a physical object. This, Kant is saying, or seems to be saying, is what distinguishes sexual pleasure from all the other kinds of pleasure or all the other kinds of enjoyment you can get from another human being. Okay, so in all those other cases, you're considering the other human being as a person, right? As a rational being with their own goals and their own interests and their own preferences, and so on and so forth. Whereas in sexual desire, in sexual pleasure, you are considering another human being merely as a physical object that you can use for your pleasure. Okay, that's what the sexual impulse consists in. Let's call to mind the guy who is checking out a girl at the gym. How is he thinking about her? How is he considering her? Is he thinking about her goals and her skills and her dreams, her values, things like that? No, he's thinking about her as a physical object that he can get enjoyment from. Okay? Um, and this is what Kant is saying distinguishes the sexual impulse, the impulse to get sexual enjoyment out of another human being, from all the other ways that we can get enjoyment from another human being. Now, to this he adds, it is plain that those who merely have sexual inclination for someone are quite unconcerned for their happiness and will even plunge them into the greatest unhappiness simply to satisfy their own inclination and appetite. Okay, so what's Kant doing here? Well, he's drawing a distinction between what we might call love and desire. Okay, so he says love involves goodwill. So here he's clearly talking about the kind of love that we saw Aristotle talk about, right? Philia. Love involves goodwill, but desire, sexual desire, doesn't. Okay, so here he's talking about what you might call sexual eros, right? Sexual desire. And he's saying sexual desire doesn't necessarily involve goodwill, right? Of course, you can combine sexual desire with love, right? So you can have both things for the same object, as we've already talked about in this class. But if you just consider desire on its own, if you just consider sexual desire on its own, it doesn't involve goodwill for the other person. Okay. In fact, it's so obvious that it doesn't involve goodwill for the other person that in some cases you might plunge somebody into the greatest unhappiness just to satisfy your sexual appetite. Here are some examples. So suppose that you find out that somebody's in love with you and you don't love them back, but you are very attracted to them. And so you lead them on, have sex with them, and then leave. This, by the way, is what the kids call hitting it and quitting it. Here's another example. Suppose you have the hots for a married person. So you seduce them and you manage to convince them to cheat. And in doing so, you ruin their marriage. You can think of plenty of examples like this, where somebody willingly causes a great deal of harm to someone else just in order to satisfy their sexual desire for them. Right? Again, to satisfy their sexual desire for their flesh, for their body, as a physical object. Kant has a very vivid image here. He says, what you do in this case is you discard them like a lemon that you've sucked the juice out of and used up. Okay? In other words, you've gotten what you wanted, and now that your desire is sated, you don't want them anymore. And so you just drop them. Okay? Again, you can combine this desire with something else, but the desire in and of itself, considered just on its own, is just that. It's a desire that once sated goes away. And so for this reason, it can lead you to do things that will harm the object of your sexual desire. So what we get in this passage then is an articulation of Kant's sexual metaphysics. Okay? His view of what the sexual instinct or the sexual impulse is. And as it turns out, according to Kant, the essence of the sexual impulse is that it's an impulse to use another human being as a means to our ends. Okay? Now, as I just pointed out, of course, you can supplement the sexual impulse with something else. Right? You can have more than just sexual desire for someone. But if you just consider the sexual desire in itself, if you just have sexual desire for someone, then what you have is merely a desire to use them as a means to your ends. And so you have a desire to use them as a mere means to your ends. So what we have here, as in Aquinas, is a very pessimistic take on the human sexual impulse. Okay, so what you have in Kant is a version of what Sobel and Helwani called metaphysical sexual pessimism. Right? Kant has a pessimistic or a negative outlook on the human sexual impulse. And the reason is the sexual impulse turns out to be an impulse to do something that is morally impermissible. Right? Human beings come pre-programmed with an impulse to violate the supreme principle of morality by using another human being merely as a means to our ends. And so, in other words, the human sexual impulse can be understood as a drive toward objectification. If you just consider the sexual impulse on its own, just the desire, it is nothing else than a drive to use another human being as an object for your own sexual pleasure. Okay? And so that's the moral problem that Kant sees in the human sexual impulse. Now, before we wrap up, let's say a few more words about this concept of objectification to better understand what Kant's on about when he talks about using another human being as an object, or thinking of them as an object. So here's another quotation. Here's what Kant says. He says, since the sexual impulse is not an inclination that one human has for another qua human, but an inclination for their sex, it is therefore a principium of the debasement of humanity. Okay, so here's how you can tell that Kant is being very serious now, is that he's throwing Latin around, okay? This is what you have to do as a philosopher if you want to be taken very seriously, is to sprinkle some Latin terms in there. Okay, so the Latin word qua simply means in the capacity of. Okay, so the sexual impulse, Kant is saying, is not an inclination that you have for a human being in their capacity as a human being. Okay, or in other words, it's not an inclination that you have for another human being as a human being. Instead, he's saying it's an inclination you have for their sex. Okay, so it's an inclination toward them as a member of a sex class. You're considering another human being simply as a specimen of a particular sex. Okay, so in the sexual impulse, Kant is saying you're drawn to somebody as an instance, as an embodiment of a particular kind of body, and not as an individual person, right? Not as a person with interests and skills and values and aspirations. You're simply considering them as a particular kind of body. And what that means, he thinks, is ultimately you're simply considering them as a set of sexual organs. Okay? That's what they are to you, or at least a set of organs that you find sexually attractive. Okay? Here's an expression I learned relatively recently. I heard some girls talking about having to get to a dick appointment. Have you heard this expression? I've also heard actually much worse things from men. What is happening when these people are talking about other human beings whom they're going to be having sex with, in these terms? Well, they're considering them as a set of sexual organs, right? In sexual desire, what you want, Kant is saying, what you're after is another person's body. That is to say, the other person's sexual organs, irrespective of who they are as a person, okay? Actually, I mean, you don't even want their body, right? What you really want is just anybody like this one, right? Anybody that has the appropriate organs, right? Whichever ones you happen to be attracted to. This should call to mind, by the way, the discussion of the uniqueness of the object of love, right? We can talk also about whether the object of sexual desire is unique. And Kant is saying no, right? In sexual desire, all you desire is a body of a particular kind. You just want a male body or a female body, or, you know, an attractive male body or an attractive female body. Any attractive male or female body will do. And in doing so, Kant is saying, you debase their humanity. You are not giving their humanity the respect that it deserves. You're not giving it the respect that is demanded by the categorical imperative, right? By the formula of humanity that we saw a bit earlier. By treating them, by thinking of them simply as a body of a particular kind, right? An instance of a particular sex, he's saying, you are making their humanity, everything that makes them who they are, into a mere means to the enjoyment of their body. Okay, so as a mere means to a particular end, which in this case is getting sexual satisfaction from their body. And so you are objectifying them, right? To objectify someone is to treat them merely as an object. And Kant thinks that this is exactly what the sexual impulse does, is that it inclines you to someone, right? It draws you to someone merely in their capacity as a physical object. So in sexual desire, Kant thinks, you just don't care about the other person's humanity. If you just consider the sexual desire itself, right? The sexual impulse itself, and not anything else about the relationship within which it occurs, that impulse is an attraction to someone, but not on the basis of their humanity. Now, the consequence, Kant says, is that any man or woman will endeavor to lend attraction not to their humanity, but to their sex. Okay, what is he saying here? Well, if it's true that sexual desire is a desire for someone not as a human being, but as a particular kind of body, then if you're trying to draw sexual attention to yourself, what are you going to do? Well, you're not going to draw attention to your humanity because that's irrelevant, right? So you're just going to disregard that. You're going to set it aside in order to draw attention to your sex. That is, to your body. Think about it. Have you ever been on a dating app? What kinds of pictures do people post there? Do they post pictures that attract attention to their humanity? Like, do they post pictures of them, I don't know, volunteering, helping their siblings with their homework, spending time with their friends, working hard at their career or at their passion, being courageous and kind and temperate, exercising their talents, that kind of thing? No, of course not. It's mostly pictures of shirtless men who are for some reason holding fish. I can't explain that, but shirtless men trying to draw attention to how good a specimen they are of the male body, and very scantily clad women trying to draw attention to how good a specimen they are of the female body, right? This is the main thing you find. Why? Well, they're trying to draw sexual attention to themselves, and in sexual desire, what a potential mate will be interested in is their body, and so the thing to draw attention to is their body. So what is Kant saying here? Well, he's saying not only does sexual desire objectify another person, right? When you desire somebody sexually, not only do you objectify them, but in trying to draw sexual attention to yourself, you objectify yourself, okay? You make your own humanity into a mere tool for the satisfaction of their sexual desire. And that's what Kant says you're doing. You are presenting your body as an object, as a tool that they can use. Now, again, to be clear, here we're only considering the sexual impulse itself. We're not considering anything else about the relationship you might have with the object of your sexual desire. Okay, so it may well be that if the relationship includes something else, then it's possible to act on your sexual desire without objectifying them. Okay, and that's actually what Kant is going to go on to discuss, and it's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. But if you just consider the sexual impulse on its own, what it is a desire to use another human being as an object, that is, to use another human being as a mere means to your ends. And when you're trying to attract that kind of desire to yourself, then you will treat yourself as an object, that is, treat yourself as a mere means to somebody else's ends. Okay, this is what Kant is arguing anyway. Now, after this, Kant says, all philosophers censure this inclination. Okay, so he's claiming that all philosophers, or I guess he means all moral philosophers, have criticized, or that's what it means to censure, the sexual inclination or the sexual impulse. Okay, they've all had negative things to say about it. Why? Well, he claims only for its pernicious effects and the ruin it brings. Okay, so in other words, they've only criticized it because of its harmful consequences. Okay, how is it harmful? Well, it can harm you, right? It can harm you if it leads you to do something that you'll later regret, or that is not in your long-term good. It can harm the object of your sexual desire, right? For example, if you lead them on and then break their heart. It can also, he says, harm society, right? It can break up marriages. It can lead to children being born in unions where they're not wanted, and so on and so forth. And he's claiming philosophers have only ever criticized the sexual impulse because of those bad consequences. Now, we know this is not true, right? We read Aquinas, and Aquinas thinks that these bad consequences are a problem, but they're not the main problem, right? The main problem for him is that the sexual impulse violates natural law. Okay, so this is not strictly true. But anyway, this is what Kant claims. And then he adds, yet there is here something contemptible in the act itself. Even if it didn't harm anybody, it would still be bad. It would still run counter to morality. So why is this important? Well, it's important because it gives me the opportunity to highlight the fact that Kantian ethics, right, Kant's normative ethical theory, is a version of what's called deontological ethics. Okay, it is a deontological ethical theory. The word deontological, by the way, simply comes from the ancient Greek word deon, which means duty. So a deontological theory is a duty-based or rule-based theory. It's a theory that says that certain things are wrong, that there are certain actions that are morally impermissible, independently of their consequences or independently of their effects. In other words, what makes certain actions, at least, morally impermissible has nothing to do with their bad effects, has nothing to do with the harm that they cause. okay, or the benefit that they fail to cause. And this is why it's a duty-based or a rule-based ethic. The idea is that there are certain rules, rules like don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't kill, that you must follow, right? That it is your duty to follow, but that are not themselves justified by consequences. Okay? The reason that it is impermissible for you to lie, to steal, to cheat, to kill, and so on, is not that those actions have bad consequences. Okay, it's not that those actions are harmful. It's something else. And for Kant, of course, as we've seen, what makes all of these actions morally impermissible, right, lying or stealing or cheating or killing, is that they violate the supreme rule. Right? They violate the supreme principle of morality, namely the categorical imperative. Always treat human beings as ends in themselves and never merely as means to your ends. Now, Kant has a complex argument for why this is justified, and philosophers argue about whether it is justified, right? But he thinks he can justify it by rational considerations alone. But what's important is that what justifies the categorical imperative for Kant is not the bad consequences of not following it. Okay, that just has nothing to do with it in his view. This is what makes it a deontological theory. And so, for Kant, what makes using someone as an object for your own sexual gratification, what makes that wrong is that it violates the categorical imperative. It is not that it causes harm to yourself or to the object of your desire or to society at large. It does cause harm, okay? It can and does cause harm. And, of course, the fact that you're willing to cause harm to someone to get pleasure from their body shows that you're not treating them as an end in itself. But the problem is not the harm. The problem is that you're not treating them as an end in itself. So there's something wrong with the action itself, according to Kant. And actually, he would go so far as to say that there's something shameful just about having the impulse, right? Just about being inclined, having a desire to treat another human being who is your equal as a mere object for your sexual gratification. Actually, he says on page 156 that we're all ashamed of possessing such an impulse. Have you ever felt sexual desire? If so, Kant thinks you should be ashamed of yourself. I'm going to traumatize you. Between getting you to read Aquinas and him saying that every act of lust is a sin, and reading Kant, and him saying that you should be ashamed of yourself just for having a sexual impulse, I'm just really going to mess you up in this class. But what you have here is a very, very pessimistic take, again, on the human sexual impulse. Okay. Of course, it's not morally wrong just to feel sexual desire. You can't control that. But there's something deeply problematic about having this kind of impulse, according to Kant. And of course, there is something morally impermissible. There's something morally wrong about acting on that impulse, at least under certain circumstances. Okay. So let's, as usual, try and reconstruct Kant's argument. This is going to be a little bit more complicated than usual, but still, I think it'll be helpful. Okay, so Kant's first premise clearly is, well, an action is morally impermissible if it treats human beings as a mere means to an end. And this is just his categorical imperative, right? This is just the formula of humanity that I told you about earlier. The idea that you have to respect the autonomy of rational beings, that you have to treat them as ends in themselves and never merely as a means to an end. Again, treating them as a means to an end is okay if you're also treating them as an end in itself at the same time. Now, what's his second premise? Well, probably something like this. The sexual impulse is a desire to use a human being as a mere means to an end. Right? And this is his metaphysics of sex or of sexuality. The human sexual impulse, he says, just is an impulse to use another human being as a means to an end. That is, it just is an impulse to objectify someone. Right? And again, the way he thinks about this is to treat them merely as a kind of body, a physical object to be used by you. And then his third premise, this is where it's going to be a bit more complicated, is something like this. If the sexual impulse is a desire to use a human being as a mere means to an end, then, right, this is a conditional, an if-then statement, unless something about the relationship involves treating one's sexual partner at the same time as an end in itself, acting on the sexual impulse uses them as a mere means to an end. Okay, so I mean, this is a lot here, but it's fairly straightforward. If it's true that the sexual impulse is a desire just to use someone as a mere means to an end, then unless there's something else that's going on, right? Something else about your relationship that makes it such that you treat them as an end in itself, well, acting on that impulse is just going to treat them as a mere means to an end. It's just going to objectify them. Think about my examples here with the Uber driver and the employee and the employer and the cashier. In all of these cases, you're using someone as a means to your ends. Okay. But there's also something else that's going on, right? Something else about your relationship with them that makes it okay for you to use them in this way. There's something else that makes it such that you are at the same time treating them as an end in itself. And in all these cases, as I pointed out, the relevant factor, the relevant detail is that you've entered into an agreement with them consensually. Right? Both of you have determined, okay, well, I'm going to exchange this in exchange for that because it's in my good. And so you've entered into an agreement. You've engaged each other as rational agents. And so it becomes okay to use each other as means to ends because you're at the same time treating each other as ends in itself. And so the third premise says something else has to be there such that you're treating your sexual partner as an end in itself. Otherwise, you're just going to be objectifying them. You're just going to be using them as a mere means to your end. And so what can we conclude? Well, if these three premises are true, then unless there's something else, right? Unless there's something else in that relationship that allows you to treat your sexual partner at the same time as an end in itself, then acting on your sexual impulse is going to be morally impermissible. Now, I actually reconstructed this thing in like 3 or 4 different ways when I was preparing the slides, and I was having a lot of trouble figuring out what the best way was to present Kant's argument, what would be most useful for our purposes. And I think this is the most useful way of presenting what he's saying. And the reason for that is that it really highlights what the question's going to have to be for him. Okay, so if you look at the conclusion here, what Kant is saying is that unless there's something about that relationship, your relationship with the person with whom you're having sex, that makes it such that you're also treating them as an end in itself, sex with them is going to be morally impermissible. You're going to be doing something, he thinks, that is morally wrong. And so the question for him has to be, what does that relationship have to be like? Right? What kind of relationship do you have to be in with the person with whom you're having sex in order to make it morally permissible, in order to make it such that you're not merely using them as means to an end? That is, again, in order to make it such that you're not simply objectifying them. That's going to be what he's going to address in the rest of the reading. He's going to try to determine what is the kind of relationship, what is the kind of agreement that you must enter into in order to be able to have sex with someone without treating them as a mere means to an end. Okay, and that's what we'll look at next time. Before we move on to that, though, here is a recap of what we talked about today. First, we talked about Kantian ethics. Right? We talked about Kant's normative ethical theory. And according to that theory, what makes an action right or wrong is whether it treats other human beings as ends in themselves instead of as mere means to our ends. Second, we talked about Kant's metaphysics of sexuality. Right? And according to Kant, the sexual impulse, what the sexual impulse is an impulse to use another human beings as a mere means to our ends. More specifically, it's an impulse to think of them and to treat them as a mere object, right? As a mere physical entity that we can use for our own gratification. And then third, we saw that this has implications for him for sexual ethics. Right? According to him, there's going to have to be some kind of special relationship there that makes it possible to treat your sexual partner as an end in itself and not merely as a means to your ends. Otherwise, acting on your sexual impulse is going to be morally wrong. It's going to be morally impermissible. So next time, we'll talk about what he thinks that relationship has to be there, what conditions he thinks have to be met in order for it to be morally permissible to act on your sexual impulse. All right, we'll talk about it next time. See you soon.